Welcome to the history of Russian fairy tales. Today, we would like to take you on a brief tour of our project, intended to bring the fascinating history of these stories to webgoers everywhere. Through our work, we intend to educate the interested viewer and help them uncover the origins of Russian fairy tales, how and why they were recorded, and their associated evolution with Russian 19th, 20th, and 21st century history. Our website is structured to guide the viewer through these questions. Our guiding template is as follows. For one, we want them to understand the development of major themes in Russian fairy tales, such as character archetypes and morality. Second, we want the viewer to learn about major themes in Russian history as well, such as paganism and political repression. Finally, we want them to learn about the interactions and influences between the two. To best approach this topic in an engaging and insightful manner, we have decided to divide our site primarily on the basis of time periods, as befitting a history course. We created representative time periods that mirror momentous shifts in Russian history, the way Russian fairy tales were portrayed, or both. To this end, we chose four. First, the pre-written history period, which will encompass the origins of Russian fairy tales and the oral traditions of pre-modern Russian society. While it largely lacked physically recorded versions of the fairy tales we have been discussing, the time period before these stories were written is arguably more important than any other time period, because this is the interval where these stories and their distinctive themes took shape. Since there is no fairy tale literature of this time period in written form, let alone film or other media, the focus here will be slightly different, and the page will feature two subsections, a longer history subsection and then a historical themes subsection as well, where we examine the origins of some of the distinctive themes of Russian fairy tales and where they came from historically. First, in the History of the Time section, we will be covering almost 1,000 years of Russian history in order to help the webgoer get a better idea of the original environment that gave birth to these stories. Since the written history of the East Slavs dates from around 800 AD, we will use this as the rough starting line for our story. From there, we will progress over the Kievan Rus, the Mongol invasion and the Khanate of the Golden Horde, the rise of the Muscovite princes, the emergence of the Russian Empire, and the establishment of the Romanov dynasty. This is a huge time span, covering almost 1,000 years. Clearly, we will not be able to give each historic event its due time, so we will be doing a high-level overview. In the second section, the historical trends of the time, we will be examining the historical trends like paganism that had a lasting impression on the future fairy tales of Russia. We have identified several historic trends for this time period that were influential for Russian fairy tales, and so we'll focus on the specific historic events that led to them. For instance, if a visitor to our site is going to understand the psychology behind a character like Baba Yaga, then they need to understand the peasant lifestyle and moral system that originally gave birth to her. In turn, this necessitates that we discuss further specifics, such as the conditions of the serfs under Ivan the Terrible. Some other historic trends we will focus on from this time period include the legacy of invaders such as the Mongols, the Christianization of Russia, the development of a separated identity from Europe, autocrats and their despotic rule, and traditionally poor, harsh conditions for the peasants. The second time period we have is early history, as in the early history of recorded Russian fairy tales. This covers the new written compilations that appeared in the early 19th century and stretches to the fall of the Tsar. The subsections we will use in this period are back to normal: the history of the time, written history, and fairy tales and alternative media subsections. The history of the time section here will cover both a historical overview and major historical trends of the period. This was a time of incredible change over all of the world as we entered the modern industrial age, and so many of the historic trends will relate to this larger theme in some way. For instance, This was seen at the very top in figures such as Catherine the Great, who ushered in a world of reforms in an attempt to modernize Russia in the way of other Western European powers. This brought up related issues such as Westernization and what it means to be Russian, the exact same themes seen in our class stories. This section will then give a historical overview while more importantly providing some context for how many of the same themes seen in Russian fairy tales also played out in a historical and geopolitical context. The written history section here represents the first time we address the literature aspect of Russian fairy tales. This section covers the impetus behind collecting Russian fairy tales, such as the desire to modernize, as well as the desire to catalog and document Russian culture and folklore. Key figures from this period that will be discussed include Afanasyev and Pushkin, and it will also introduce the first written incarnation of characters like Baba Yaga, Koschei the Deathless, and the Firebird. Finally, the alternative media here will cover the creation of Russian fairy tales in non-written forms. What constituted alternative has shifted over time, but for this time period, we will be considering the emergence of Russian fairy tales in music, ballet, and opera. Artists such as Stravinsky emerged towards the end of this time period, and examining them will be a great way to show how the conception of these stories, from their basic narrative to their characters and moral lessons, will begin to change with the times. Our third section, Fairy Tales under the Soviet Union, will cover the rise and fall of the USSR and the resultant effects on fairy tales. We will start with the Russian Revolution of 1917 and cover until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Russian history of this section will have a huge impact on the ideology of the people, and as a result, will affect the themes of the fairy tales. Starting with Lenin and the advent of communism, we will trace the history of the now USSR through the Stalin era and ultimately culminating with Gorbachev and the policies of perestroika and glasnost and the resultant crumbling of the Soviet Union. As a result of the shift in ideology, broad shifts across Russian society occurred with the creation and rise of the Soviet Union. These shifts will affect the themes apparent in the fairy tales. For example, the atheist official doctrine of the USSR will affect the religious symbolism within the fairy tales. Before the Soviet Union, a general theme of competing elements of paganism and Christianity were apparent within the stories. However, after the rise of communism, the element of Christianity no longer appears. The shift in politics is also seen within the social interactions in Russian fairy tales. Increasing tension between economic classes occur thematically to reflect the emphasis on the common man and equality furthered by the communist government. Our discussion of alternative forms of media will continue in this section. Also, as a reflection of the shifts in society, changes in the themes of religion and society will also be apparent in forms of alternative media in their representation of Russian fairy tales. As the end of the Soviet era comes to a close, new forms of alternative media will begin to enter the historical scope of our website as the technology of the era advances. Our fourth and last section, Modern History, will cover from the fall of the Soviet Union until the present day. The history of this section will cover the transition of the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation and the first elected president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. We will also look at the privatization of the Russian economy and the presidencies of Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. Because the history of this time period is still developing into modern day, we will also discuss the lasting impact that Russian fairy tales have had on modern culture. Again, we will cover how the shifting political ideologies will affect the themes of the Russian fairy tales and associated media in the modern age. The transition to a privatized economy largely affects the attitudes and beliefs of the Russian people and therefore affects the resultant character of the fairy tales of this period. As we transition to a society that is more and more dependent on technology, alternative media plays a larger and larger role in our lives. To adequately represent this importance, A larger portion of this historical section will be dedicated to the depiction of Russian fairy tales in alternative media. Alternative media also reflects the lasting impact of fairy tales as they affect popular culture. For example, an entire episode of the animated show Scooby-Doo featured Baba Yaga as a villain, and Keanu Reeves' character was compared to Baba Yaga in the recent film John Wick. Our website will also feature an entire biography section in addition to the 4 historical periods. Like the historical periods, the biography and key terms section will have a link on the main page of the website. This link will take you to the page where the viewer will be able to scroll through an alphabetical list of all the major figures, characters, and terms necessary to understand the history of Russian fairy tales in a broad sense, so that the reader will not have to click through multiple links whenever they would like more information on a key topic. Whenever one of these key terms will appear elsewhere on the website, the word will link to the corresponding biography page in order to make the website more accessible and streamlined. For example, if the viewer is looking at the early history page and would like to learn more about Alexander Pushkin, all they will have to do is click on his name instead of going back to the home page and then the biography section and then scroll around to find what they need. We will then separate these into further subsections to explore these specific issues. The subsections are as follows: an overview of the Russian history of the time, an overview of history of relevant literature, and an exploration of Russian fairy tales in alternative media. After all of these have been discussed, the reader will be able to understand the development of fairy tales over time through the context of Russian history. The Russian History of the Time section will give a brief overview of relevant political, economic, cultural, and social issues and changes during the specific time period in order to ground the reader in the context of the time. This frame of reference for the environment that the fairy tales came out of will help the viewer better understand the evolution of the fairy tales themselves, which will be covered in the next subsection. The written history section will cover major recordings and writings of Russian fairy tales. This naturally will also include important authors and links to further biographical information, as well as explore the changing landscape of the Russian fairy tale from shifting morals to an evolving definition of what it means to be Russian. Finally, the alternative media section will explore Russian fairy tales in media other than the classical written or oral context. This category has shifted over time from music to opera to ballet, film, and even TV in the present day. And so this category will give the reader an idea of the lasting impact and the way the medium and even the very idea of what constitutes a Russian fairy tale has shifted and grown over time.